fuck, guys? Just holy fuck. As I'm sure you've guessed, assuming you haven't actually listened to the latest episode, the new Hunt the Truth was something to behold. If previous episodes were dominoes being lined up, today was the first domino to fall, starting a chain reaction that's going to send waves out into the Halo universe. So without further ado, let's take a look at Hunt the Truth, Episode 9. We open up to a very nervous Ben as he's trying to get all his materials together before Pharaoh hacks into the government hearing to allow Ben to reveal the true horrors Oni had committed to forge the Spartans. 2 hours to broadcast, and Ben is recording Anthony Petrovski's statement while trying desperately to reach Meshach. Meshach was supposed to organize the evidence in a manner that would be convincing to UEG senators and will ultimately make up the bulk of proof of Ben's claims. As Ben continues to try and contact Meshach, he notices that in general, reaching the outer colonies is becoming increasingly difficult. With just over an hour to go, a message from the outer colonies finally makes it through, but not from Meshach. Instead, from Katrina, childhood friend to John 117. Her message starts out by asking Ben if he'd heard any feedback from his latest episode, begging him to contact her if he had. Unfortunately, Ben hasn't been able to check on any feedback since, well, he wasn't exactly diligent in securing the feed when he set things up. After nearly being locked out by Oni before, Ben is pretty sure they could trace him if he were to try and check. As such, Ben is pretty much in the dark about the consequences of his actions. Luckily, or perhaps not so luckily, Katrina gives him some insight. She paints quite the picture, talking about how people have resorted to using local chatternet to communicate and of demonstrations in the streets. Interestingly, she notes that these demonstrations are being led by a group called the New Colonial Alliance. Sound familiar? It should if you've kept up with recent Halo comics from Dark Horse. Introduced back in Halo Initiation and briefly brought up in Halo Escalation, the New Colonial Alliance is a post-war rebel group led by former UNSC Admiral Matthias Drake. Since Halo Escalation number 6, however, we haven't really heard anything from them, despite hearing plenty about post-war insurrectionist activity. So, from an outsider perspective, it's actually really cool to hear their name brought up. Katrina continues her tale of NCA protests, the leaders talking about preparing for boycotts and shutting down UEG embassies. She notes that it's relatively peaceful at the moment, but she isn't exactly positive it'll stay that way. The story then takes a darker turn, as Katrina explains her feeling of being targeted, likely for helping Ben. She notes that she's had extreme trouble talking to him, that there have been mysterious power outages and corrupt files on her computers. Ellie Bloom seems to be in a very similar situation. Katrina's message then comes to an abrupt end, seemingly cut off. Not long after, though, Meshach finally comes through. Along with the files he promised, Meshach was also able to dig up police reports and calls surrounding one of the Spartan candidates that had run into their clones years after the abduction. From what we're able to hear, it does indeed sound like it was a reference to the events of Homecoming from Halo Legends. Not necessarily what we saw, but what was talked about near the end of the episode.
After making contact with their clones, the remaining 2 escapees used their small arms to commit suicide.
Ben is grateful as all hell, and before they're about to part ways, Meshach notes that, after the broadcast, he and Ben need to talk about what's going on in the outer colonies. Before Meshach can say anything further, however, Pharaoh cuts in. Pharaoh gives Ben a quick rundown of what's going to happen, explaining that she might have to cut his end of the feed during the Senate hearing, and if that happens to keep talking. He won't be able to see them, but they'll be able to see him. Basically just a small countermeasure in case Oni starts to get wise. With all the details settled, it's showtime. Ben is given a video feed of the hearing, 12 senators, 3 Oni directors, and Michael Sullivan among the crowd. A moment later, Ben goes live, and presents his case to the senators. Ben makes his introductions and then plays Petrovski's testimony. During all this, Sully contacts Ben, giving him one last warning. Ben responds that he's done playing party to Oni's lies, and Sully's response is pretty chilling. Yes, you are. Ben is done. Oni is done. But it doesn't quite hit him just yet. Petrovski's testimony finishes and Ben makes his conclusions. As he does, he's encouraged to rush, Oni doing all they can to track Ben down and, presumably, end him. Ben finishes just in time as Pharaoh cuts the feed. Pharaoh thanks Ben for his service, her voice clearly taking a more sinister tone, and notes that he is now under, quote, our protection. The call ends, and Ben is alone. The gravity of what he's done finally hits as he starts to panic about what's going to come next. And what comes next is his bank account being frozen. Oni is starting their push against Ben by cutting him off from any financial assets. Suddenly, 2 delayed messages come through. The first is from Meshach, and he's very clearly anxious. Things in the outer colonies are starting to escalate, to the point that Meshach is now trying to make his way to Ben, desperate to talk. Not over the net, but in person. Unfortunately, Mashak would never make it. The message he left was the last Ben would ever hear from the eccentric hacker. The second message is from Katrina and confirms what Ben is hearing from the inner colonies. The outer colonies have been completely cut off. No one can make a call out there, and everyone out there is in the dark. Oh. This series has been escalating ever since Ben was called in by Michael Sullivan in episode 3, and it's finally come to a head. The truth is out there. Oni and the NCA are making their moves, and millions of innocents are caught in the middle. The weight of this episode is still hitting me even now. It seems that humanity is finally on the verge of all-out civil war. Ironically, the very type of conflict the Spartan-IIs were created to circumvent. And where does Master Chief fit into all of this? I've heard it suggested that the Chief might have caught wind of Oni's plans, and may be fighting to prevent whatever terrors Oni might have in store to quell the growing discontent of the outer colonies. Kind of funny that the Chief may in fact be instrumental in causing what he's trying to avoid, if this is true. And of course, as always, we circle back to Pharaoh. From her final words to Ben, it's very clear that she's been manipulating him to her own ends. She's credited as a rebel leader, and given the mention of the new colonial alliance in this episode, it seems very clear that Pharaoh is part of that movement. But as always, we must ask, who is she? Obviously, any notion of her being Halsey or Cortana or Petra is completely out the window, but I still think Ilsa Zane may be a possibility. She was a member of the NCA, one familiar with Oni, the Spartans, and has led others before. She is capable, ruthless, the kind of person who would go for the throat. Well, I think that's it for this episode. If you haven't listened to it yet, please go do so now. It's something that needs to be experienced. Thank you for joining me as always. Until next time, this has been Halo Canon. Hey guys, thanks for watching my video. It means more than I can express in a few minutes of audio. If you did like it, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, share it around on whatever social media you see fit, and all that jazz. Thank you so much. Your support is everything. I would not be where I am without you. Thanks.